Hey, it is Xennial Gamer, and today we're going to be talking about a guild content only tier list. Now, I actually did this tier list on stream, so if you guys want to see the entire breakdown of the tier list, I am going to put an info card on screen right now. But for this video, all we're really going to be doing is covering the highlights of kind of why each monster is in each tier. And then I want to remind you guys one more time, this is guild content only. So I do plan on doing an RTA tier list probably in the next week or two. But for the time being, what we're looking at right now is just how good are these monsters in guild content PvP. So a couple of things that come along with that. The first is that this list is skewed a little bit towards offensive use. Most of these monsters basically got their tier primarily for how good they are in offense. However, there are some monsters that are just amazing on defense, and they did get bonus points for that. Now, one example that is not on the tier list is Savannah. Now, the reason for that is because I didn't make this original template. I was just using the template that I was sent, and the Beast Riders were not in there. There were a couple of other monsters that were missing as well. But for what it's worth, if I had to put Savannah on this list, because we're talking about guild content only, I would probably put her in the SS tier. The reason for that is because I think she's somewhere between a B or an A monster on offense, and I know a lot of people will disagree with that, but she is very RNG based. However, she is definitely in that top 4S broken monster tier when it comes to defense, so I would still have to push her up somewhere in the SS range. I think a lot of these monsters are going to kind of speak for themselves, so in this video I'm not going to break down every single monster. I want to talk more about the overall thought process that went behind it, and then maybe some monsters that people might agree or disagree with. To start off with, I did do a 4S tier right here that I just called Broken Monster. These are monsters that basically, if you lose with this monster, it's either because your opponent just outclassed you in runes so much that it's unreal, or because you just brought it in at like a ridiculously bad time. Now, Ileana being in the Broken Monster tier, sitting there right next to Oberon and Gianna and Rahul, that doesn't quite make sense, right? Or more importantly, Ileana being in a Broken Monster tier higher than Leona, higher than Odin. Why is that? It's because you can bring Ileana in on 4-star bases, and you can put her on defense in 4-star bases. So that's going to be a theme through a lot of the top tiers. Monsters in guild content PvP, and I know it's both Guild War and Siege, but if you can use them in a 4-star Siege base and they're really, really strong there, then I did give them some extra credit for that. So in our top tier, you basically have Wunsa, who is, the premier stripper with incredible base speed. You can do a ridiculous amount of incredibly powerful offensive and defensive combinations with her. Rahul, one of the most powerful monsters on defense and kind of an auto-win on offense. Gianna, Oberon, both fit in that category. And then Clara, we see Clara in basically every single defense these days. Why? Because Clara has perfect AI. And that perfect AI on defense means quite a bit, especially when it's a monster with really good base speed that can be built to be extremely fast and then can just strip and stun your entire team. Okay, for the triple S tier, these are monsters that are just flat out OP. Generally speaking, throughout this list, the other theme you'll notice is I highly value monsters that can set themselves up over monsters that require setup. And then I highly value monsters that are going to give you reliable, predictable, constantly doing the same thing, as opposed to monsters that are going to be heavily RNG based. But there are some exceptions. So for example, Nephthys. Nephthys does require setup. Nephthys needs a stripper. But Nephthys' skill is then irresistible once the strip has been applied. And technically you could put a Nephthys with, let's say, a Tiana, because Nephthys is already giving you that 24 speed lead. So compare that to the Shan down there in the S tier. Now, Shan is also an incredibly powerful monster. He's got an AoE stun, he's got an AoE attack bar boost, he gives a speed buff to allies, his Squall is going to hit really hard, just like the other Chimeras. But Shan needs also that same strip setup in order to give an AoE stun, and he doesn't offer the same speed lead, so he gives you less flexibility in your comps. The stun is not irresistible, so he's not always going to be able to stun the enemies. Now, he will always, of course, attack, bar boost, and speed buff, but if that's all he does, then he didn't bring a lot to the fight, and of course, Shan can be manipulated by Joltan and by some other dark monsters. He has a lot more direct counters than Daphnis does. So, again, most of these monsters in triple S tier, it's because what they do is either irresistible or it's ultra consistent or they bring a lot more to the table. And then the big thing is you'll see Mimir and Kamun are both your 24 speed leads in guild content, and they get extra credit for that as well. Now, when we get into the SS tier, this is where we get pretty much the rest of the really good LDs. So you're going to see Ragdoll and Jaeger, and this was on stream. A lot of people were like, what the heck? Why is Ragdoll in only double S tier? So there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is simply that Ragdoll's nerf was legitimately a nerf. He's not as good as he used to be. He's still amazing. I mean, he's still SS tier, but he did drop down a step when they reduced the amount of attack bar boosting off his passive. Now, the other thing, and the much more important thing, is as I put these tiers together, what I was basically asking myself is, does this monster belong in the tier with these other monsters? So if I put a Ragdoll next to a Daphnis, and we're talking again just about guild content, which one do I think is going to give me the better chance to win? And the Daphnis is the one. The Daphnis is basically always going to win. Now, the Ragdoll is almost always going to win. I mean, the Ragdoll is still incredibly OP, which is what makes it double S, but it's just not quite in that same tier as like a Daphnis or a Hertite or an Artemil. So again, we have most of the rest of the really premium LDs are going to be in this tier with the Volantis and the Pater, Cadiz, Tian Lang, and you could actually argue Tian Lang belongs in triple S. He's kind of on the border. But probably the biggest, most controversial one here that I think most people will find is going to be that Shazam. I legit put Shazam in double S tier, guys. I really think he's that good. I think that his last buff was the tipping point, and I think a lot of people are still sleeping on him because he's got a bad reputation, but I'm telling you, AoE provoke, AoE glancing, and a 2-turn defense break on skill 1 is absolutely legit. I don't have Shazam, and maybe if I did, I'd have him down in F tier. I don't know, but when I've used him on other people's accounts, he's a ton of fun, and I think maybe that influences me a little bit as well. If a monster is super fun, then I'm going to use it more often, and sometimes you've got the same opportunity to win with, you know, 2 or 3 monsters, and you're going to go to the one you enjoy the most. But when you get down to the end of the list, and you see the Collie and the Bulldozer, there might be some questions on those, and it goes back to that whole point of, I really value consistency. I value monsters that are going to do exactly what I expect them to do every time. Now, the few other monsters that might really surprise people in S tier are going to be down near the bottom, which would be the Tetra and maybe the Dozer and the Collie. And we're going to talk about why they're there in a moment, but before that, I've just got to back up a step, and I want to point out that if you see underneath the letters on each tier, I have what that letter rating means to me. So for me, I break most monsters down into one of 3 groups. There are monsters that you win because of, there are monsters that you win with, and there are monsters that you win despite of. So a monster you win despite of would be like a Christina. If you give Christina G3 runes, you can make a winning comp. But if you gave those same G3 runes to any of 100 other monsters, you would win more easily and you'd be less nervous about it when you use them. So you can win with pretty much any monster in the game if you give them good enough runes and you build a good enough comp. But that doesn't mean you won because of that monster. It means you won because of your strategy and your runes. So that's a monster that you win despite. Now, a monster that you win with, a lot of them tend to be support types, or they tend to be monsters that are, for lack of a better term, universal. So what they do may be a little bit unique, but it's not ultra unique. They serve a role that can be served by any of a whole bunch of other monsters. They may serve that role slightly differently or better, but ultimately you could replace them with any of a bunch of other monsters and get about the same outcome. So that's a monster you win with. As a good example there, Chasun is an amazing healer. Fran is an amazing healer. Fran gives you immunity. Chasun gives you Fallen Blossoms. They're doing things differently, but they're serving the same role. Then there are the monsters you win because of. The monsters that are just flat out OP. The monsters that you see soloing 1v3 in Siege or 2v3 in Siege. Those are your Fenyangs, those are your Ragdolls, those are your Neftis. So, Within those parameters, a monster that you win because of is usually one that you can rely upon. If you can't always rely on it, then yeah, sometimes you win because of it, but sometimes you also lose because of it. So the other universal truth is that 50% is a fantastic rate on defense, but anything under 100% is not a great rate on offense unless you're just like completely outclassed. Like if you're just moving into G3, obviously you're not expected to win 100% of the time, but generally speaking on offense, we need to win all the time or almost all the time. On defense, 50-50 rate is good. So that means RNG is great on defense, but it's a lot less valuable on offense. So this brings us back down to like the Dozer, the Collie, and to a lesser extent the Tetra. The Tetra is up there just because she's such an amazing counter to so many monsters that are above her on the list. Drop a Tetra in against Rika, against Belenus, against Nephthys, against Asima, and I'm just like reading through the Quad S list right now, and that Tetra is pretty much going to lock down the team with any of those 4 monsters in there. And yes, guys, I put Daphnis in A tier, sitting right there next to Brandia and Veramos, and the bigger surprise for some of you may be the fact that I put Veramos in A tier as well. I don't know. But yes, so there are a lot of people. I mean, Daphnis is in practically every RTA match, but again, this is guild content. Daphnis is a monster that people absolutely love. I do too. I think he's an amazing monster. I think he's a lot of fun. He's got an awesome animation, and when he works, it's just awesome to watch him delete an enemy monster, but he doesn't always work. Even if you've got max accuracy and they have no resistance, you're still going to get resisted 15% of the time. So ultimately, Daphnis is a very heavy RNG monster. Now, if you use him against something like an Odin just because you know that you can outspeed the enemy, then when he gets resisted, he may still delete that Odin. But for the most part, if you try and use a Daphnis against anything that's a little bit thicker and you get resisted, it's going to result in a loss. When Volantis or Triton's strip get resisted, we usually lose. And then there are some monsters in here that they may be relatively reliable. We know what they're going to do. For example, Poseidon's never going to glance, but they're just, you know, going back to, do they belong in the tier with the monsters above them, right? So if I compare Poseidon to like a Xingshi or even to a Rauk, who I just noticed Rauk actually is at a place because I tried to organize all these tiers by LD5, Nat5, LD4, 4-star. And it looks like the Rauk got stuck in front of Tessarian. But anyway, that notwithstanding, when I try to compare like a Poseidon to a Rauk, how devastating can a Rauk be as opposed to how devastating can a Poseidon be? You put a Rauk on defense and it can delete your entire team. You put a Poseidon on defense and it can just say hello to Lucian before you kill him. So there are some kind of variances here as far as in the A tier. Some monsters may be predictable, but they're just not predictably OP. And then some monsters may be OP, but they're not completely reliable. That's pretty much the makeup of your A tier. Now, a couple of other monsters that might raise eyebrows in the A tier. The biggest of these is going to be Geldnir, because he is a meme. But I'll tell you what, guys, I think Geldnir has always been underrated, undervalued. I really think Geldnir, at least, I mean, we're talking about guild content. Obviously, he's not a cleave monster, so a lot of people sleep on him because you can't cleave with him in arena. You can Lucian him on arena defense. I think he's a really good monster, and guys, think about what he does. He does a heavy-duty heal on his passive. Who else does that? Molly. Molly is ultimately a little bit stronger than Geldnir, and Molly would be in triple S or quad S on this list if I had had the icon for her. But Geldnir serves the role of a Molly, and he serves it really well. Now, the problem with Geldnir is he's an LD5, and for him to only do what he does is disappointing. So does he need a buff? Absolutely. His buff is really pretty straightforward as well. Instead of healing one monster, he should be healing all monsters, and instead of healing them for 35% of damage received, he should be healing them for 35% of his own health. That would make him super tanky, and that would allow him to do the heals that's necessary. With that said, even though he does need a buff for guild content PvP, he does belong in A tier. Remember, a lot of this comes down to opinion, and some of those opinions are going to be altered by whether or not you have a monster, whether or not you enjoy a monster, or if you've only fought it. So obviously, most of these LDs, I don't have any of them. I've only fought them, so my opinions are mostly formed by how much difficulty I have when I fight someone else using them. But when I take a look at Ciara and I compare her to the tier above, and I ask myself, does Ciara belong in a tier with Isis or Tian Lang or Laura or Cadiz? The answer to me is no. And then it's the same question above, you know, is Cadiz as good as Nephthys? Definitely not. So a lot of these monsters, like we think of a monster, immediately we say, oh, that monster's triple S. But the reality is that when we're ranking monsters, what we're doing is ranking them all in proportion to each other. So to me, when I look at the placement of these monsters, I do think that Nephthys belongs in flat out OP triple S. I think that for guild content, Gianna is stronger than Nephthys. I think that Nephthys is stronger than Pater, Pater is stronger than Ciara, and Ciara is stronger than Chow. Ultimately, that's how I wound up with this tier list. So if you look at some of the other monsters in A tier, Kabila is another one that might stand out. She's got, you know, 120 base speed, attack bar booster, but she becomes more of an endgame monster because you have to put her with some sort of other attack buffer or just have absolutely crazy runes to cleave with her, especially in guild content. Now, as we move into the B tier, which is monsters that you usually win with, you're going to see the two LD5s here. First of all, it's the Pontos and the Acroma. People who own Pontos are probably hating me right now. But honestly, I just feel like he doesn't do enough. You can win with him, and that's the definition of this tier. You win with him usually, but he doesn't do enough to justify taking a spot compared to all of the other options that we have above him. Now, Acroma is one, to be honest, I'm kind of questioning myself a little bit right now. I think maybe Acroma should have been an A tier. She's a very situational monster. You're going to bring her in to counter enemies that are heavily debuff. And to me, you can also do that with immunity, which is why I think I initially put her in B tier. But to be fair, monsters like Nephthys or Ciara, Gianna as well, all of those are a little bit harder to counter with immunity. Nephthys just because she's usually going to be paired with strippers. Same thing with Ciara, and then Gianna because she is a stripper. So Acroma honestly maybe could have been up one more tier. Okay, as we move into the C tier, this would basically be your list of LD5s that need buffs. I mean, pretty much with the exception of Wally Young, because Wally Young's buff did make her pretty decent in Arena. She's just not really very good anywhere else. I feel like she probably still needs a little bit more, but she's definitely in a class above. And then Mana, or whatever the hell you call him. He did get buffed recently, but I don't feel like the buff was quite enough. But Nyx and Kraka, I mean, they're just totally non-meta. You can, and again, this is the tier of you win with them sometimes. So you can build some really interesting, fun teams with Nyx. I think if I had Nyx, I'd actually have a lot of fun with him because I'd screw around with like Rika or, I mean, there's a lot of different teams you could have fun with, but none of them would be stable, reliable teams. Now, the Samantha and the Vanessa, premium arena monsters, they serve a very limited counter role, though, only in guild content, which is generally just they need to serve a role to act as a reviver. So, like, you can use a Samantha to counter Kamun Bastet Odin team, for example, where the Samantha takes the hit and resurrects. The problem with that is Odins tend to be built on Violent, and that second Odin hit will still delete your Samantha and then fully restack the Odin, so very situational. Same thing, you can use Vanessa to counter that team and allow Vanessa to resurrect the monster that takes the hit, but again, it's still a little bit of a risk when you're going in against a Violent Odin. A lot of the C tier for me, these are all monsters that will just nuke something out with setup. The monsters that don't qualify as nuke them out with setup, you would have a monster like Amarna, and probably this is going to be one of the most controversial things on this list. So I'm just going to make my case right now by saying that Amarna is amazing in that he does a little bit of everything, but he's problematic in that he doesn't do anything best. There's no one thing that he's the best at. His entire kit is mostly lower activation rate, so he's not a guaranteed defense break. He's a skill 1 defense breaker, but it's not guaranteed. He's not guaranteed heal block. He's not guaranteed brand. He can do an entire team resurrect, but it adds so much cooldown that once he resurrects your team, he will never be able to heal or cleanse in that fight again. And when he resurrects them, they're only at 30% health, so you're not going to be able to get them healthy enough to keep them in the fight. The kit just overall doesn't fit well together. I'm going to make the exact same case, but be less long-winded about it with Escher. Escher basically can be a bruiser or an attack bar booster, but he can't really be both because you're either building him in Swift or you're building him in some sort of bruiser set, and the two just don't fit well together. Then we get to the D tier, and these are mostly monsters that I just think are fun to use, but really don't have any value. They're monsters that require an incredible amount of setup. and then ultimately are very heavily RNG based. Then we get to the E tier, and these are the monsters that you can sometimes win despite. These are monsters you just have to give them, you just have to be dedicated. Like, you really, really, really want to use this monster, so you're going to give it your best runes, and you're going to spend hours theory crafting a comp, and then you're going to cross your fingers and hope it works. Just because you like the animation or something like that. And this is basically like Melissa's a pure PvE monster. Belita is a nowhere monster. I mean, Belita is just terrible. And then we get down to the bottom tier, which is just don't build it. It sucks. And again, we're only talking about for guild content. So you've got monsters in here like Faye. Faye makes no... I guess you could probably argue that Faye should be in the RNG tier. She could be in the D tier. But really, you shouldn't be using Faye in guild content. I mean, it's a 25% chance to ignore defense on a random target. It's just way too variable. These are just the monsters. When it says don't build it, we're talking just about for guild content. So anyway, guys, I'm sure there are going to be quite a few controversial picks in here, because what tier list doesn't have controversial picks? But go ahead and tell me in the comments what parts you don't agree with, which monsters you think should be higher or lower. But as always, guys, I appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time. Hey guys, if you're still with me to this point, then that means that you probably liked the video, found it entertaining, or even better, both. So please smash the like button, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment down below, because those things help the channel grow, and more importantly, they show me that the video is useful, and that's the whole reason I do this in the first place.